Hey, my name is Tristan, and I'll be analyzing Chapter 1 of From Out of the Shadows by Vicky Ruiz. Um, so we'll start here with question 1. It talks about the status, the social and economic status of Mexican women as opposed to white women in colonial and Republican societies. Um, so I first want to talk about the social aspect. So she says somewhere between page 5 and 7 that page 5. At the end of page 5, she talks about how Spanish speaking women were sort of fetishized in a way as flashy, um, loud, obnoxious, I believe morally deficient was one of the adjectives when compared to Anglo Saxon white women. Um, this is materially kind of in line with the historical sort of European tendency to fetishize a sort of infantilization of women. And I'll go on later to explain why that's not a moral deficiency that is inherent to other people, but it is something nonetheless that materially arose. So there was that sort of social stigma surrounding Chicano women. Now, economically, before the U.S. Mexican War, the Mexican American War, white women would be subordinated or subsumed into the property ownership of their husbands. They were no longer seen as independent political actors in their society, right? Um, Conversely, I believe is what Ruiz says. Uh, Mexican women were independent. They were independent political actors, independent economic actors in their society. Um, this is not necessarily actually historically progressive, but it is a difference in the sort of political superstructure of their societies. Obviously, after the Mexican American War, Hispanic women were treated then as second class citizens, just as Mexican men were. Their political independence was ultimately stripped from them. Now, on to question 2. To provide a precise analysis of Ruiz's concept of heterogeneous Mexican community. So let me pull that up. Heterogeneous Mexican community. She states, such a heterogeneous Mexican community is not new. Throughout the 20th century, a layering of generations can be detected in schools, churches, community organizations, work sites, and neighborhoods. Now, doing my best not to pigeon the listener here, let's go through what heterogeneous actually means. So it comes from hetero, meaning not the same or different, right? And genus, referring to origin. So not of the same origin is what heterogeneous would mean. So heterogeneous Mexican community. What does that mean? What does Mexican mean? No. A heterogeneous Mexican community would be a community of Mexican people who come from different origins. So, for example, I think very similar to the one given by Ruth Tuck, I believe, is you have a household, right? And the mother is from Mexico. She is an actual immigrant from Mexico. And there goes my light. And the father was born here in America. He is nationally an American. He is, I guess, genetically, he is Mexican, but as a political actor, he's an American citizen. He's an American person. This would automatically be a heterogeneous Mexican community. They're both uh, sort of in touch with their Mexican culture, but they come from different origins. Right? So the second half of that question says what she means by using the words to describe different generations of Mexicans and Mexican Americans living in the U.S. that speaks to their economic and social status during the early 1900s. She goes on later in this explanation to say that despite these differences in genus, right? The heterogeneous nature of these communities. They all lived in poor housing, right? They would all earn uh, what was it, $150 a month, which I mean at the time was far different than it is now, but still, they were working class people, real working class people, not just employed people. They were actually members of the proletarian class, right? The people that reproduce our society. Um, they would send their children to so-called like Mexican environments, Mexican schools, I believe, and encounter these same practices. It's like a self-perpetuating superstructure based on a material contradiction in economics, the need for expansion to maintain their economic system. So, yeah, on to question three. The labor of Mexican and Mexican Americans was essential to the emerging mining, railroad, and agricultural industries and big businesses beginning during the early 1900s, right? So, right before World War I, right before the Great Depression. And continuing to this day, they are a critical labor force throughout the U.S. And tying this back to the reading, identify and explain the specific laws passed by the U.S. Congress that increased Mexican employment in California, as referenced in the reading. So I want to talk about the what's it called? The Immigration Act of 1917. Here, let me get it on the book. Where is it? There we are. So, what was this act? I'm going to pull a little bit from just information that I already know about it. But the Immigration Act of 1917 was essentially designed to build a stronger border, right? And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. But when you combine strict border laws with imperialism, which forces people into your country, that's where you get that real bad contradiction, right? Where you're throwing legal people out of your country. Anyways, I digress. The Immigration Act of 1917 included things like a head tax, which is essentially an entry fee into the country, so you have to pay money to get in, a literacy test, among other things, to kind of prohibit the entry of circular migrants, which I'll explain later, and just more formal border enforcement. Right. So back to the question: what specific law was passed by the U.S. Congress that increased Mexican employment in California, as referenced by the reading? Why would this increase employment? This Immigration Act. It would increase formal employment, which is what was measured, and what is measured, and what has always been measured. Formal employment, right? Not kind of freelance labor or anything. More people that are kind of forced to stay in the country are more likely to be formally employed. Simple as that. On to which ethnic group constituted the majority of California's agricultural workforce in the 1920s? Mexicans. There you go. I am back with no hair and a different shirt, but I'm going to answer questions 5, 6, and 7. So, number 5, evaluate two primary sources utilized by Ruiz in chapter 1, discussing their significance to her argument. So, let's direct our attention to page 9, where Ruiz says, as examples, in 1930, the three most common occupations for Mexican men were in agriculture, 45%, manufacturing, 24%, and transportation, 13%. Only 1% held professional positions. And then the second source is later down on that page, where she says, Lawrence Cardoso, I don't know, indicated that in Mexico, field workers could earn 12 cents per day, while the U.S. Southwest daily wages for similar work ranged from $1 to $3.50. That second source is really what I want to look at, because that one seems more important to me, because I don't see a moral argument to be made about agriculture in relation to professional positions. Right? That's like a more broad argument. But anyways, for the second source, it's a clear disparity in material realities for these two groups of people, right? The people that are in the Southwest and the Mexican field workers. Mexican field workers clearly are being underpaid in part because they're more easily exploitable labor. This is true throughout history, um, at least since the development, the economic developments of the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, kind of liberal Enlightenment thinking. Um, that is important to our argument because it highlights, let's just say, inequality, even though it's kind of a buzzword. Um, yeah, and then for the first source, we can virtue signal as much as we want about how, agricultural workers are very important. And yes, obviously they are, they make our world go round. But we do know materially that professional workers are compensated more for less labor, than sort of agriculture and industrial workers are, right? So again, we see a race, sort of like an intersectional group, being forced into a certain class, because of their status legally. So let's go to question number 6. Assess the implications of the Immigration Act of 1917 for Mexicano migration patterns. We talked about this a little bit in question 3, talking about the laws that were passed by U.S. Congress that increased Mexican employment. We know that the Immigration Act of 1917, more most importantly, kind of puts these sort of restrictions on migration patterns, and how Mexican migrants could move around. You know, more there was like a tax on entering the country. Um, you know, instead of just allowing free circular migration, as was talked about earlier. So obviously there was more one-way migration. There was more settling in the country than the sort of moving around, right, for financial purposes. And now formulate 2 open-ended discussion questions that promote a critical analysis of the chapter's themes. So, hello, sorry, I noticed that there was some background noise, so I closed my door and hopefully that's much more quiet. But 2 critical questions. Let's get into the sort of meat and potatoes of where these arguments are actually coming from, right? We see just off the bat that many of these arguments come from a place of a kind of Western liberal sense of what equality means, right? A sort of political abstract equality to have rights to do things and not to do things, right? It never asks questions about what a real democracy looks like. It never asks dialectical material questions of how these prejudices and how these material conditions form in the first place. Um, so my first question would be, and this is a question that I sort of have a loose answer to, but is treating the group of people that marginalizes another group of people, is treating them as somehow flawed inherently, submitting to their argument, right? That there is a fundamental difference between, let's just say, white and brown people. And if you want to make that like distinction, let's just say people from Europe and people from South America. That there's like an actual ontological, sort of difference there between the two groups. I think that to admit that, my hair is kind of all over the place. To admit that and to say that the Europeans have a tendency towards racism or whatever, or prejudice, or the perpetuation of injustice, you're admitting in a way that they're right, that there is a difference in the nature of individuals, when I think that is ridiculous, right? So it's important to ask what material conditions caused the rise of such ideologies, because ideologies don't sort of come out of nowhere just purely rationally. They're the product of an economic base structure of our society, right? Um, Whether or not you agree with that is a whole nother discussion. Whether or not you're like an idealist or a materialist. But I'll go on to my second question now. So my second question is going to be about what society looked like in uh, Mexico before, um, honestly, American colonization. So we're going to turn back the wheel a little bit, back in time, and take a look, because this is really important, right? Because we look at culture as a kind of thing that develops independently, when it's not. It is most definitely not. As I explained previously in my last question, it's a dialectical relationship between a base structure economy and the superstructure of culture and religion and etc etc etc. Right. So my question is, what was the mode of production? Right. I would assume, without doing any research, that it was some kind of Asiatic, like centralized state with independent little like villages or village communities that were self-sustaining, because frequently these sort of societies, which are much more communal, are more likely to produce social norms that are, again, more social and less antisocial, as we see from European modes of production and American modes of production, like capitalism and feudalism and, slavery, if you want to say that's a separate mode of production. I would argue it's not, but whatever. Yeah, my question is, why was the culture, as we can see, it's clearly different, as we talk about the Spanish woman being sort of independent from their bridegroom or whatever, and how European women were seen as a kind of a part of their husband, right? So what led to that cultural discrepancy? It was not that South Americans have a different nature than Europeans. No, it had to have arisen materially. So was there some kind of Asiatic or primitive communist mode of production um, in South America prior to American colonization? And is the Latin American, Mexican, is that sort of more family oriented communal culture a direct result of that? And how has it changed as Mexico develops economically and becomes more integrated with the United States and like the wider global economy? So yeah, there's questions 1 through 7. Hopefully that was not too long. I'm gonna edit this down a little bit, so it's not really hard to listen to. So thank you for listening. I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye bye.